Good morning, everybody. Happy Monday. We have an amazing show for everybody today. What do we have, Krystal?
Indeed, we do. A lot of big stories breaking this morning. First of all of these major primaries march on some big ones. Perhaps the biggest one on the map for tomorrow in the state of Georgia. Trump, of course, backing Perdue versus the incumbent governor, Brian Kemp. We'll give you the latest there. Also, the very latest in terms of results coming out of Pennsylvania, where we still do not have answers as to who will be the Republican nominee for Senate. As of now, I would say Oz has picked up a little bit of ground. It's looking more likely like it'll be him, but it still is totally anyone's game between him and McCormick. So we have the very latest there. Also some devastating new polling for Biden about how people are feeling. Hilariously, how the administration is trying to spin that as well. And some new revelations from Hillary Clinton that you do not want to miss. Plus, big news breaking actually overnight. Biden is overseas in Japan, and he made some pretty bombshell comments that seem to surprise everyone.
Yes.
The reporters who were there, his own team, effectively changing the long-standing U.S. position towards Taiwan of strategic ambiguity to affirmatively say, if China invades, we will meet them militarily.
Yeah, it's the second time that he said that, except this time he explicitly said yes to the military question. So we got lucky.
Yeah, completely unambiguous. Yeah, we got lucky. I would love to say that we planned this in advance and we knew this was going to be, on the menu for today, but it just so happens that we actually have a Taiwan expert, Elbridge Colby, who is booked for the show, who can dig into all of this. The other big news that's coming out of this is a new trade bloc. Is this sort of TPP by another name? They're saying it's going to be ultimately more limited, so we can dig into those details with Elbridge Colby as well. But we wanted to start with those primaries in Georgia and across the country.
Yeah, that's right. The Georgia primary is just incredibly significant on a variety of levels. I mean, I think that any political analyst, myself included, in terms of what we thought was going to happen, is that Brian Kemp was completely toast in the Georgia gubernatorial primary, especially when David Perdue, the former senator, decided that he was going to run for that. He barely lost his Senate seat there to Jon Ossoff, and it seemed him being blessed with the stop the steal Trump magic. How could he possibly lose? And yet, poll after poll after poll shows Perdue not just down, but down by over 30 points. And the New York Times actually did a decent write-up on this. Let's put this up there on the screen. What Donald Trump did not count on in Georgia. What they point to is that, number one, David Perdue did not want to run for governor. The president, former president, Trump, blew up his phone constantly, being like, you really need to run for governor. You really need to run for governor. You have my complete and total endorsement. You're going to make sure that I'm going to make sure that you win. Remember that he had promised that he was going to go out of his way in order to make sure that Brian Kemp lost the election. He promised that many times in November. He said, no matter what happens, I'll be here campaigning against your governor, Brian Kemp. But as we see now, Kemp has a tremendous amount of loyalty amongst the Republican faithful. And it's fascinating because even Trump Republicans who are in the primary, Krystal, poll after poll shows us this, say, yeah, I like Trump. I identify as a Trump Republican, not even a Republican. But Brian Kemp, he's not all that bad. And it's a really fascinating test case of how much Trump can borrow his own personal political brand and make his own voters embrace it fully. So, this is, if things go the way that the polls look like, and look, we have no idea, been burned by polls in the past, it is a tremendous humiliation to Trump.
Yes.
There's no other way to say it.
I think, so there's a lot here. I mean, first of all, the best that Perdue can hope for at this point is to force a runoff.
Yeah.
So to keep Kemp under 50%. And let me tell you, it would take a dramatic turn of events and the polls being wildly off.
Yeah.
Even for that to happen, I mean, right now, Kemp is up around 60% or even more than that. So, he has blown Perdue out of the water on this thing. And what the New York Times found, and I've been listening to a lot of Greg Bluestein has a podcast that's just focused on Georgia politics. We've a great reporter that we've had on this show from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. And Kemp has been an extremely conservative governor.
Yes.
I mean, he's hit sort of all the cultural issues for Republicans. He did a CRT bill. He did a very restrictive abortion bill. He's done very, gotten rid of all the sort of any gun control legislation. That's been stripped away. There was a tax cut. He's also paired that with, so he's, been culturally very conservative, also did very restrictive voting laws, which were extremely controversial. Remember, Joe Biden called them the Jim Crow laws, new Jim Crow laws or something like
probably
that.
Probably helped Brian Kemp, actually.
In the primary, I think it probably did, right?
Yeah.
So, and then he's paired that with, he's had a few big wins in terms of economic development. There's a new electric truck plant east of Atlanta. He just recently announced a new Hyundai electric vehicle plant to be built outside of Savannah. He gave raises to teachers and state government employees. So in terms of the Republican base, he's been there on every single issue. So I think that's the thing for Trump is in some of these other races, like with J.D. Vance or with Oz, where, if Oz wins, I think Trump's endorsement will have been the determining factor. It was a situation where you had candidates who were a little bit less defined. They were a little bit less known to the base. So Trump's imprimatur really made the difference. Whereas with Kemp, Georgia Republican voters felt like, no, we know this guy.
Yes.
Yeah, we know you're not happy with him on Stop the Steal, but he's done this other list of things that are important to us. And so we appreciate your guidance here, but we're going our own way.
Yeah, I've been really thinking about it. And I think one of the keys might be this. A lot of the Republicans, self-identified Republicans who were maybe voting in the Pennsylvania primary, Ohio primary, they were not really Republicans before that, or they weren't politically activated. They were Trump people who really brought them out. Whereas, Georgia Republicans, Georgia's been a Republican state for 60 years. So if you consider it in that way, these people have been culturally conservative and Republican identifying for decades, long before Trump ever became on the scene. They like Trump, but they're existing Republican voters, and so they're maybe capable of thinking about politics in a different way and much more maybe not, when I say values oriented, I mean around what the Republican voter in general cares about a lot more. And because Brian Kemp has stood by them on all of these except for Stop the Steal, which never really was a core Republican thing. It was much more of a Trump Republican thing. Well, then that really does help his case. And look, all of this is bearing out in terms of the last polls heading into this race. Put this up there. This is Fox News poll. Shows that Perdue is down by 32 points. Kemp leads him, basically avoiding a runoff completely. 60% of voters prefer Brian Kemp compared with just 28%. And if you think about it, over March, this has had a substantial shift during the campaign. Perdue actually had 39% whenever he announced with some of the Trump figure. But with Kemp being able to make his case on the airwaves and say, no, I'm the real conservative, I'm the real, Republican in this race against David Perdue, and all David Perdue has on him at the end of the day is Stop the Steal. So this is a good, a very good test of how much that actually matters to the mean Republican voter. And we've said this a million times, in the middle of inflation and all this other stuff, you're putting up guys like Doug Mastriano, or if Perdue, had become the governor, their only case to be made is, I'm going to overturn the election, not deal with all this other stuff that's going on in your life.
Perdue seems to have also run a really terrible campaign.
That's true.
He basically, in the home stretch, seems to have kind of given up. He's barely doing any public appearances. Yep. He's not up on the airwaves. Now, there is outside spending, putting ads, I don't know if they're for him or against Kemp up on the airwaves, but his own campaign is not running any TV ads in the final week of the primary. That's bananas. And this is a very wealthy individual. You were saying he barely put any of, comparatively.
He only put $500,000 of his
which
own
for
money.
him, he was one of the wealthiest senators.
I think his net worth is something like $60 million. He was the CEO of Dollar General.
So if he wanted to put in more, he could. Trump is kind of trying to distance himself, trying to wash his hands of him a little bit.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, on the other side, all kinds of Republicans are lining up behind Kemp. First of all, the entire Republican caucus in the Georgia state legislature is effectively behind him at this point. So he's got all the hometown people behind him. He made some very smart moves in terms of taking some key players off the board by giving them sort of plum positions within his administration to shut them up. Very clever. Folks like Chris Christie are coming in to sort of, be on the side of this winning candidate against a big Trump-backed candidate. And the most significant one is Mike Pence.
Yep.
Who seems to, there's a new piece out this morning in the New York Times, who seems to be testing the waters for potentially running in 2024, even if Trump is there. Now, do I think that effort will be successful? No, I do not. But clearly, by backing Kemp in this kind of proxy war between the hard Trump-aligned forces and the somewhat more Trump-skeptical forces, he is also trying to sort of, lay the groundwork here and put his own political stamp on this.
It's a big deal. Mike Pence is going to be on the ground tonight, with one of the last rallies there for Brian Kemp. And, I think it just comes back to what I was saying. Guys like Chris Christie and Pence and all of them, they've been around for a long time, longer than Trump. And a lot of those Republican voters there have also been in the party longer than Trump, quite literally. literally. So when you consider that, it makes sense that it's going to be more of an independent-minded place. We have some of the ads that both Brian Kemp and David Perdue have been playing just to give you guys a taste of what it looks like down there. Let's take a listen.
I understand you may not agree with everything that I've done, but you can't say I haven't done what I promised I would do. We had to protect lives, but also livelihoods. That is why we are in a fight for the soul of our state.
Illegals flooding our border, skyrocketing gas prices, crippling inflation, the brink of war. Folks, that all started right here when Brian Kemp sold us out and allowed radicals to steal the election. Kemp is just another establishment politician who fought Trump. Enough is enough.
There you go. Doesn't work.
It was interesting. Bluestein even said that in the final weeks of this campaign, Perdue has shifted his messaging away from Stop the Steal. Because it clearly was not, it wasn't enough. There needed to be some other agenda plan. Hey, here's my economic plan when people are struggling, and that is clearly their number one issue. Let me make the opposite case, a little what the Perdue people would say. There's been extremely high turnout in early voting. Their, spin on that is, oh, that's all the energized Trump people and the polls aren't capturing what's really going on.
Maybe.
Just want to put it out there. Yeah. That's what they're saying. The other thing that's interesting, though, about that vote is Georgia has open primaries, so you don't have to be a registered Republican to vote in the primaries. The Democratic side is a foregone conclusion. Stacey Abrams is going to be the Democratic nominee. Obviously, Raphael Warnock is going to be the nominee for Senate, the incumbent Democratic senator there. So the Democrats could vote in the Republican primary, and so far in the early vote, something like 6 to 8% of the voters have actually been Democrats.
They're all going to vote for Perdue, I assume.
No, no, because there was one of the reporters at AJC interviewed a number of these voters, and they all said they're voting for Kemp because they're so concerned. They know that a Republican is likely to win this year. They're so concerned about the implications for democracy that even though they're certainly not big Brian Kemp fans, at least the, I think, 16 or so voters who fell in this category were Democrats voting in the Republican primary. By this particular reporter said, we're voting for Kemp because we're worried about Perdue and election certification. So will that be a factor? Who knows? And could that be contributing to some of the surge in turnout? Possibly. There's another couple of races here that are interesting. You've got Herschel Walker is very likely to be the Republican nominee for Senate to go against Raphael Warnock. He sort of ran away with that race. The other one that's interesting, though, is remember that guy Brad Raffensperger, who's the Secretary of State, who became very famous or infamous, I guess, depending on your view. When this call was released between him and Trump, when Trump was urging him to, quote, find enough votes to reverse his defeat in Georgia. The polls there, very close. There's a Trump-backed candidate against him named Jody Hice. That one, I think, is kind of a jump ball from the best I can tell. There's less public polling, but the public polling that exists has even that one tied. And that's another one where you would think that this guy, his whole reason people know about him is in opposition to Trump. His whole job is to sort of be, the arbiter of free and fair elections in the state. So even the fact that, that one isn't a slam dunk for Trump either is pretty telling.
Oh, I think that this is tremendously telling about the pure just power of Stop the Steal. Frankly, it's kind of heartening. We'll find out how exactly it works out in Pennsylvania. But I think, I've always said that even for the people who believe, you should at least have faith that normal folks are normal folks and they're not going to make this their top priority because they're not crazy, especially whenever there is high gas prices, inflation, culture war, wherever you want to stand on it. All of those things rate for people much higher than whatever happened in an election that we basically know all of the results from. And let's put this up there. Even Trump himself basically riding off into the sun with humiliation, washing hands of Perdue in Georgia as his campaign limps into the final stretch. You alluded to this. David Perdue, he's not on TV, trailing badly in the polls. He's written off by every Republican political insider, both nationally and in Georgia. And at one time, he was the presumptive gubernatorial nominee. So to him to have the backing, and Trump having, come to the state, backed him, said for over the last 2 years that he would do everything in his power in order to defeat Kemp, and for Kemp to still win that primary and even avoid a runoff humiliating. I mean, there is no other way to say it. And it's a good insight into politics around how much some of this nonsense actually matters. I'm not going to say that it doesn't. If Mastriano becomes a governor, that genuinely could trigger like an actual constitutional crisis. But in terms of Brian Kemp or David Perdue, at current times, it looks like that could be avoided. Maybe we'll watch this clip back, in 2 days and be like, wow, the guy actually won the election.
Yeah,
so
we were totally wrong. Okay.
We'll see. For now, it looks like that's what's going to happen down there.
Yep. Another interesting story, though, Saagar, on the Stop the Steal front.
This fits with the exact same frame, so let's put this up there on the screen. You guys will recall we brought you this news several weeks ago that Mo Brooks, the congressman from Alabama who was running in the primary there for the Senate seat that was open, was ditched by Trump for going, quote, woke. Now, I don't like wokeness. However, the president's definition is getting pretty expansive here because what Trump accused Mo Brooks of going woke for was basically saying, I'm not gonna vote to decertify the election if I were to become senator. By the way, he didn't even say that about a future election. He said it about the past election.
Right, and also he said something vague like, I think it's time we look forward.
Yeah, he said we need to move on from what happened in 2020,
and
which okay.
By the way, this is a dude who literally spoke at that January 6th
he was at the rally. Yeah, that's right.
So it's not like he's been a squish.
In reality, what happened here, I don't think that he really thought he'd, quote, gone woke. I think he thought he was gonna lose.
Yeah,
and then
right.
what happened, and he didn't want to be humiliated again. And look, he's got a decent enough track record, especially if Oz wins. But it's like I said, in Trump country, which really is to me like the industrial Midwest, the Trump endorsement matters a lot. In the Deep South, like a Jeff Sessions, Jeff Sessions did lose, I guess, to be fair, whenever he was running. But in the Deep South, where a lot of these people, especially with Trump more off the scene than he was at the time, it's not so clear whether Republicans there are going to take all of their cues from Trump. And what they point to here, Krystal, is that Mo Brooks is in a dead heat with Kelly Britt, who looks like she could be with Britt, who at this time, is holding 31%. This is from the Alabama Daily News Gray TV poll that just came out on Thursday. But Brooks was at 29%, well within the margin of error. And I just think it shows you what's also interesting is that the other parts of the Republican establishment are also kind of coming to Mo Brooks' defense. So you both have Ted Cruz and Rand Paul, who are down in Alabama in a last-minute effort in order to try and get Mo Brooks elected. He is actually desperately hated by Mitch McConnell because he's more of a rabble-rouser like a Rand Paul or a Ted Cruz, more willing to hold up votes and to vote against the party establishment. And he had that famous clip that we played here on our show where he was talking about how much it costs in order to buy committee seats and really just telling the truth, being like, yeah, you want to know how corrupt this whole place is?
Yeah.
Like, this is how it actually is.
Well, he actually said he would not support Mitch McConnell for majority leader. So yeah, there's definitely yeah, and that was sort of like on Trump's wish list of things he wanted his candidates to do. So Mo Brooks checked every box, but since it looked like he was going to lose, Trump walks away. He unendorses. He throws the most sort of the worst thing you can possibly call someone in the Republican Party, which is woke. He throws that terminology at him. And then my understanding of what happened here, I'm no expert on Alabama politics, but Katie Britt is kind of the, she's a former chief of staff to Senator Richard Shelby. She's kind of the establishment, pick, the sort of Chamber of Commerce pick here, I guess you would say. And then Brooks and the other dude, Mike Durant, who's a retired Black Hawk Down Army pilot, those two have been trading off. So when Brooks was down, Durant was up.
Yep.
Now Durant has fallen off and Brooks has risen in the polls now to sort of rival Katie Britt. And what effectively happened here is Britt was spending a bunch of money to attack Durant, and that caused him to fall off in the polls. But instead of those voters going to her,
they're going to Brooks.
They're going to Brooks.
Right.
So that's kind of how that has shaken out. But it is pretty funny. I mean, the other thing that one of the articles I was reading pointed out is that Trump does not have a great track record in Alabama. In the primary, he endorsed against Roy Moore.
Oh, yeah. What was his name? Big John or something like that?
I do not remember.
Yeah. I think
Moore
it was Big John.
Ends up winning.
Yes.
And then Trump endorses Moore for the general election, and then he ends up losing. So Trump's track record in Alabama in particular, not terribly good at this point. I honestly think a lot of Trump's influence where it's the most significant and where it doesn't matter as much. I do think it has a lot to do with how well-defined these public officials are in terms of the public's mind to start with. For Ohio, I think J.D. Vance positioned himself in a smart way for the Republican base in Ohio. And Trump giving him his blessing sort of created a permission structure for them to forgive the things he'd said about Trump in the past. Like there was a desire to sort of support him. Trump gives him his blessing. The field is relatively undefined candidates. Oz, there was a lot of skepticism about him, but none of those other candidates in that primary in Pennsylvania are particularly well-defined. So Trump, the fact that you had a three-way split there and Trump putting the blessing on Oz maybe looks like potentially gave him enough to get him over the edge, but definitely not having the same impact in Georgia or in Alabama at this point.
Yeah, no, I think that's right.
On the Democratic side, there is basically one race that really is kind of the marquee, and that's this Texas runoff between incumbent Democratic Congressman Henry Cuellar and progressive lawyer Jessica Cisneros. Let's go ahead and put this one up on the screen. So, this is going to be a really interesting test of how Roe versus Wade plays in a district that, frankly, it's an interesting one because on the one hand, it is a Democratic district. It's a pretty solidly blue district. On the other hand, because you have a very large Latino population, it's actually culturally conservative. So Henry Cuellar, the incumbent Democrat there, is the only or one of the only remaining pro-life Democrats in the Democratic House caucus. That has not stopped Nancy Pelosi. Jim Clyburn actually went to the district. Actually, Pelosi recorded a robocall for Cuellar. This at the same time that they're, out of the other side of their mouth talking about how Roe versus Wade is, this existential threat to women and Republican attacks on women and all of this. And yet they're still perfectly comfortable with lining up behind their own incumbent pro-life congressman. He's also very conservative on other issues. He was the only Democratic vote against the PRO Act in the House as well. So he also is anti-union in addition to being anti-choice. This is the second time that Cisneros has taken on Cuellar. Let's go ahead and put let's see, which one is it? A8 up on the screen there. She lost narrowly last election cycle. She forced him into a runoff, and then he narrowly defeated her by about 3,000 votes. This is, she's once again forced him into a runoff. And, little plot twist, the FBI raided his house. Now, we don't know, I want to be careful here, whether he's the target of this investigation. Go ahead and put A7 up on the screen here. But we now have word that the FBI will not officially clear him of wrongdoing, if they are going to clear him of wrongdoing, before Election Day. This is, your home and office being raided by the FBI is pretty extraordinary, especially they try to avoid sort of intervening in politics.
They do not do this unless there is an extremely good reason. I remember actually whenever we said that about Richard Burr, I was like, look, you don't take a sitting member of Congress's cell phone unless you know what's going on here.
There's something sketchy.
Same thing in terms of bursting into somebody's house.
Right. So I did some digging into what this might be about. And again, we don't have any word from the FBI. This is all somewhat speculation. ABC News had reported the raid was part of a federal grand jury probe. Subpoenas sought records from organizations with ties to Azerbaijan, as well as 3 Texas companies with ties to Cuellar's wife. So Cuellar randomly has all these deep ties now to Azerbaijan. He traveled there in 2013. 2 years later, they announced an agreement between Texas A&M and an organization called the Assembly of Friends of Azerbaijan for the purposes of collaborating on oil and gas research and education. He's reportedly taken his own trips to Azerbaijan. He co-chairs the Congressional Azerbaijan Caucus also, according to the Texas Tribune. So the speculation is there's some sort of something going on between the Cuellars and Azerbaijan that the FBI is looking into.
Odd. I mean, I do. So full disclosure, my parents work for A&M, but I think it's a different A&M than whatever this one is. But as I understand it, Azerbaijan also has a lot of oil, so it could make sense that he's doing advocacy on behalf of the oil industry. But I mean, maybe a little bit more than that.
And then the wife has some businesses with ties.
Got some
Anyway.
In general, whenever
he asserts his innocence.
When a
let's say that.
Central Asian Caucasian, and I mean that Central Asian Caucasian businessman comes to you, you should probably say no. If you are
a member of Congress.
Didn't think you'd have to say that. That's a reminder to Hunter Biden too.
Yeah.
By the way.
So, to tie a bow on this thing, I am going to show you a little bit of their ads. And then we also had a reporter from Status Quo on the ground there talking to voters. Bernie Sanders came into the district for Cisneros, did a big rally there. All of sort of the progressive left have lined up behind Cisneros. Like I said, this is her second crack at this thing. She came very close last time. And last time there was not an, open FBI investigation involving the congressman. But, it is extraordinary that I get it, you're incumbent, but this guy is at odds with you in terms of choice and in terms of unions at a time when Roe versus Wade is obviously really, really central to what a lot of the Democratic base is focused on. And that Clyburn came to the district, Pelosi recording robocalls for him where she said, he stood with hardworking people even though he's the lone vote against the PRO Act. It tells you how committed they are to their own principles. We have a little bit of sound to play for you, starting with a Cuellar, a hilariously low-budget Cuellar ad that very much portrays him kind of in the district knocking doors, being the man who has the deep roots and ties in the community. That's how he wants to portray himself. And this is and then after that, immediately following it, is a Justice Dems ad, which is focused on abortion rights, which I think is probably more of an online play than what the in-district messaging is for Cisneros. So you've got sort of the local play from Cuellar, and then you've got what the outside groups are saying to the national audience for Cisneros. Let's take a listen to that.
Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi is once again reiterating her support for the lone member of the House Democratic Caucus who opposes abortion rights.
House Majority Whip Jim Clyburn rallied support for Congressman Cuellar in San Antonio yesterday.
We are watching the fall of Roe. We don't want Henry Cuellar to be the deciding vote on the future of our fundamental freedoms and rights in this country. I really hope that the Democratic leadership doesn't stand in the way of the change that South Texans want.
So anyway, there's some of the messaging, both from on the ground and also kind of what national folks are talking about. I also will say there's reports from Dan Marins of Huffington Post, good on-the-ground reporter, or not on the ground there, but good reporter on progressive politics in particular. Cuellar is definitely using every dirty trick in the book. They put out these flyers that are meant to look like newspaper articles saying FBI clears Cuellar.
Oh, that's a classic. Yeah,
not true, by the way, not true at all. They also accuse Cisneros of being a, quote, homewrecker. So clearly he feels it's enough of a threat to kind of dig into the bag of dirty tricks. As I mentioned before, we did have a reporter on the ground from Status Quo who was talking to some of the voters. I believe they were outside of that Bernie rally for Cisneros, and one woman in particular indicating that she actually had been a Cuellar supporter and she was switching her vote this time around specifically because of abortion rights. Let's take a listen to that.
What brings you out here to support Jessica today?
I'm not voting for Henry Cuellar anymore.
Was that a recent? I know there was a lot of national attention after Roe v. Wade and people coming out.
I mean, that was the determining factor. I probably would have just kept voting for him because he's the person who is the incumbent, but I am more aligned with Jessica's policies, what she believes in on lots of issues, and I totally agree that we need a new person in there who's not just in it for the money.
Well, and being in it for the money, what are your thoughts after that sort of gained that national attention that a lot of Democratic super PACs, and then we had Pelosi and Clyburn come in to support them?
I was shocked by that. I was very upset that Clyburn came to do that. I don't know what he was thinking with that. I think that a lot of people don't really care about what the issues are. They vote against their own self-interest all the time, and they're just totally tribal. I think it's much more about what team you're on than it is about what policies you want.
So hard to say how reflective that is of the broader district.
Yeah, who knows? I mean, like I was telling you, it's a crazy part of the country. I really recommend everybody try and go there because it is unlike basically anything that you'll have ever seen. In terms of the politics, like that's nothing compared to how it usually operates down in deep South Texas. And Henry Cuellar has been a player for a long time in terms of his ability to basically have the votes, be a representative there of the South Texas, area, but also have deep, deep ties to the oil and gas industry and the business community in Texas. He's beloved, even amongst a lot of Texas Republicans and like very establishment types. So we'll see how it pulls out. It's going to be an interesting one. In terms of the actual electorate, I genuinely have no idea. I mean, a lot of these people are actually Catholic and are probably personally pro-life. That being said, I don't think that they've ever cared that much about abortion because a lot of them have also voted Democrat. But you also see that the South Texas GOP swing does continue in some of the mayoral elections and in some of the more Republican enthusiasm down there. Also, not all South Texan, Hispanics are the same. So these people are longstanding Democrats. More to say, we'll see what happens.
Yeah, we will see what happens. And we do know that it's been shifting enough for Cisneros to come very close now.
Yeah, she almost won last time.
Yeah, she almost won last time. She's obviously forced him into a runoff again. So there clearly, at least among the Democratic base, are some frustrations. Will it be enough between the FBI investigation and Roe being, the center of Democratic base politics right now? Will it be enough? I think it's really impossible to say.
Yeah, that's
so we'll
right.
See.
Okay, let's move on here. Let's talk about Dr. Oz. We still don't know if he's going to be the next GOP nominee or not. So let's put this up there on the screen from Steve Kornacki. So here's what he says. Where things stand right now, we are still waiting on the remaining 10 precincts from Allegheny County that should be small, about 500 ballots. There are roughly 8,000 mail-in ballots scattered across the state, perhaps 200 to 300 overseas military ballots, and then up to 2,000 provisional ballots, and likely fewer. Now, before that, what's been happening is that the Oz statewide lead is around 1,000 votes. That is significant because the latest batch that came in from Allegheny County actually had Oz beating McCormick, which matters because McCormick is from Allegheny County, and we pointed out previously that Pennsylvania has this weird thing where if you're from a county, they print your name first. By the way, that doesn't seem fair to me. I think it should I guess alphabet, whatever. I don't know exactly how these things should be determined, but that seems like it would give a person a home advantage, and that was long pointed to by the analysts on our show as well. Now, in terms of what's happening, though, with the meta fight, in reference to our first block on Stop the Steal, there's quite a bit of hypocrisy going on here from Mr. McCormick. Let's put this up there on the screen. McCormick's campaign has now sent a letter to all counties in Pennsylvania arguing that undated mail-in ballots should be counted, citing a court order that found a state law requiring that ballots be dated is immaterial under federal law. Now, Krystal, I recall an entire high IQ Stop the Steal discussion about Pennsylvania election law and about how this defrauded the voters of Pennsylvania and how undated ballots themselves were a form of theft on par enough for a senator from Missouri in order to object to the certification of Pennsylvania election results in the United States Senate in the midst of a mob that was trying to storm the Capitol. But hey, that was just like a year ago. What do I know about what's going on here? Very interesting to see the Stop the Steal candidates themselves. McCormick, who is fully on board, the election was stolen. Now, when his ass is on the line, he's like, oh no, we gotta count those ballots.
Yeah,
we gotta get those ballots counted immediately.
It's almost like it was never a principled.
So it's not interesting. Interesting. Dr. Oz actually calling him out on this. Let's put this up there in terms of his statement. He's like, David McCormick is a formidable opponent, but it is becoming obvious he is likely to come up short. Unfortunately, he is following the Democrat playbook, a tactic that could have long-term harmful consequences for elections in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. It's a clear contrast between Dr. Oz to secure America's process and John Fetterman. So now he's actually pivoting to attacking John Fetterman.
Who he
and
calls
Oz,
extreme liberal socialist.
What he is doing is Dr. Oz is reclaiming the Stop the Steal ground in order to bludgeon McCormick. So look, the bottom line is we have no idea what's going to happen. This thing is absolutely going to a recount because it's within the 0.5 margin of error. What exactly that means for the actual vote count itself, given that we still don't even have that, I think that's crazy. I think the only legitimate Stop the Steal argument that I've found amongst the high IQ discourse is why the hell does it take so long to count these votes? That's the one thing I don't understand.
Yeah.
Why does it take this long? Pennsylvania, I mean, New York, remember, it takes like weeks in order to count primary ballots. That is the one
New
thing
York is a mess.
New York is a complete
New
mess.
York is a mess.
A lot of places around. I truly don't know. Maybe this is just the price of living in a federalist country where every state, gets to decide how this stuff is run. But we gotta make sure that this stuff is faster.
We still don't know the results in Oregon.
Yeah,
either,
exactly.
Where a Democratic incumbent probably lost, but
well, they're all vote by mail.
All vote by mail. So yeah, it's a little more understandable there. But so I mean this thing is as close as it comes. It's still possible for McCormick to pull it out in the mail-in ballot, when those all get counted, because he did better in the mail-in balloting than he did on the election day balloting. But the fact that the votes that came in from Allegheny County that hadn't been counted on election day but came in on election day, that those went for Oz, that was a pretty big blow to him. I mean, in terms of the undated ballots, like McCormick, I think, is right on the substance. If they came in time before election day, then obviously they weren't recorded after election day. If they came in before election day,
says that they're legal, Krystal. So if it's legal, then count
it's
it.
legal. Yeah.
I mean, if you want to outlaw it, you're welcome to.
A court decision has also already ruled, as he's pointing to. But it is hilarious the way that he is clearly.
But at that time, they were telling us that court was, that was violating.
Yeah, exactly. And we also know.
So now the court's legitimate.
We also know if Oz was on the other side of this,
he'd be doing the same thing.
He would be doing the same thing. So anyway, just typical politics there. In terms of what this means for the fall, I think. Look, still Republicans, whether it's McCormick or Oz, definitely have the edge. I personally think Oz is a stronger candidate in the fall because he has that celebrity potential crossover appeal. There were other analysts who were making the other case. I just don't agree that, he had low favorability ratings with the Republican base. True. So maybe that would depress Republican turnout for him in the fall, but I just don't see that. I think Republicans are going to be energized in the fall to vote against Democrats, no matter who their candidate ultimately is. They are 100% going to be there to support Dr. Oz, even though they may not love him, over John Fetterman. So I think, he'll have the Republican base. The question is, can he get those independent and crossover votes, especially when issues like Roe will be central. And I personally think Oz probably has a better chance of pulling that off than David McCormick, who's like a nothing special hedge fund douchebag.
Yeah, I was trying to explain this to some people who were telling me otherwise. I'm like, Dr. Oz has the same strength that Trump has in that he's ideologically malleable. He doesn't care about anything. Now, that's a good thing, and it's a bad thing. It's a good thing because David McCormick actually does have a worldview, and it's bad.
Right.
He worked for a hedge fund and, instrumental working for one of the most pro-China billionaires in America who continues to be an outright shill. Dr. Oz basically just goes wherever the winds blow. Now, that's exactly what Trump did. Ideological malleability is exactly actually how you win over voters. A lot of people don't know this, but in 2016, Donald Trump was actually rated as less conservative than Mitt Romney amongst the general electorate.
Right.
There's a reason for that, because he was saying stuff about trade, he was saying things about, healthcare, making obviously all these promises, and that actually bore out in the 2020 election as well. A lot of self-identified moderates voted for Trump because they see him as less conservative on a lot of stuff. And by that, I mean the ones that are most out of step. Now, obviously, Dr. Oz is pro-life, but I don't see a world where Dr. Oz is endorsing outright national bans the way that Herschel Walker just came out and said in Georgia. By the way, good luck with that, in that state.
Yeah. It is interesting. In 2016, between Trump and Hillary, voters said Trump was more moderate than Hillary.
Exactly.
In 2020, voters said Biden was more moderate than Trump.
Yep.
So, in terms of sort of who independents found more appealing, I do think that ultimately made a difference. So, I think, as I said before, I think Democrats put up about the best candidate that they can in John Fetterman, who has deep roots in the state, who has a good affect, who has a kind of, genuine, authentic, everyman vibe. He's got himself positioned in a relatively intelligent way in terms of economics, kind of populist economics, and has moderated some culturally in terms of his positioning on criminal justice and on immigration. But can you overcome those national headwinds, especially when you're going up against someone who I do think is a formidable competitor? I think it's a very, very large challenge.
I think this, Krystal, if he ran in 2018, John Fetterman's going to be the next senator, right? You know, Bob Casey at that time, I just looked it up, won 55% of the vote, but it's not 2018, it's 2022.
Yeah.
And the political environment is just completely different at this time. And there's just not a lot that you can do about that. You know, Fetterman is probably as moderate, well-known, you know, in the entire state as Bob Casey was, but, you know, as you saw at that time, even Lou Barletta actually wasn't a terrible candidate there for the state of Pennsylvania, but he lost because of the national environment. It's just how it goes in terms of these things.
That's a perfect segue to our discussion about the national environment and how terrible the polls look for the Biden administration right now. I feel like we could do this segment every day, but the numbers continue to get worse and worse and worse, so we have to keep talking about it. Let's go ahead and put the latest from Ed O'Keefe. This is details from a CBS News YouGov poll. His editorial here is there's large and growing pessimism about the national economy, the stock market, and inflation. In fact, outlook on the cost of things gets the most pessimism of the items tested, following by pessimism about the national economy. Eric, keep this up on the screen because I want to read off these numbers. So he has up here the comparison between when these same things were tested back in September of 2021, not all that long ago, versus now. So now we have 77% saying they're pessimistic about the cost of goods and services. 77%. Back in September, it was still bad. It was 70%, but it's gotten worse. National economy, you now have 68% saying they're pessimistic. Back in September, that was 58%. So it was bad. It's gotten a lot worse. Same story with the stock market. 67% now say they are pessimistic about the stock market. That compares to 49% back in September of 2021. In terms of people's sentiment about the president himself, let's go ahead and put this next piece up on the screen, also from Ed O'Keefe. He says he gets relatively, although also not good, higher marks for caring about people than he does for being quick to react to events. Overwhelmingly, 65% of people say that when important things come up, Biden is slow to react. That's versus 35% who say that he addresses things right away. Now, O'Keefe's spin is that he's like, people feel like he cares about you. Not really. 56% say that he either doesn't care much or not at all about people like them. It's just those numbers aren't quite as bad as the numbers on when important things come up, Biden is slow to react. And I just think that's hard to deny, Saagar, frankly.
Yes.
I mean, this has been, even among their allies, they admit that this has been a very reactive administration. There isn't a sense that there's a plan, a vision, that they're anticipating problems and getting out ahead of them. It very much seems like, you know, events happen and they're sort of buffeted by them. And after too long of a wait, under a lot of public pressure, maybe they'll move to act. The baby formula crisis is a perfect example. They admitted they knew this was a problem
in February
for literally months, and yet it took to get it getting to the point where, you know, babies were having to literally be admitted to the hospital because they couldn't get the nutrition that they needed, especially babies that needed special formulas, for them to actually act and do anything. So I think it's pretty hard to deny that, you know, whatever you think of the overall direction, that they've been very reactive and it's been very slow and sort of on the back foot in terms of responding to emergent events in the world and here in the country.
I think the hardest number for him, I think cares about people like me has always been one of the most important questions in all of politics. And Biden cares a lot about people like you. A lot, 19%, some 25. Not much, 22, not at all, 34. What's the biggest number there? And then what's the second biggest number? Like, when you point to these things and the, you know, basic majority of people say that Biden does not seem to care about people like me and then is slow to react, which is obviously something hard to define, but it's a vibe almost in a certain way. It just is generally true in the terms of how he's reacting to major events. I'm doing my whole monologue on this, on exactly what Biden could do literally right now in order to lower the price of gas, relatively bipartisan, I think, in both of these solutions, and yet not a single one of them has even been discussed, has no bill on the floor, nothing in the administration, and the record price hits the record every day for the last 3 weeks.
Wow.
What's happening? I mean, you know, gas is $4.50 a gallon nationally, and yet there is no discussion. We're heading into summer. Rolling blackouts are on the horizon in Texas, in Indiana, and in California. We have major grid issues and stuff that the military and others should be working on right now. What's happening? I mean, these are, and by the way, if you think that the Biden approval rating is, you know, as low as it is right now, the dog days of summer, mid-July, late July, rolling blackouts and $6.20 gas nationally, what's going to happen? I mean, you're dead. I mean, Doug Mastriano will be governor then. Just go ahead and watch out for that. So I just think that all of this is so obviously true. And that's why the reason we did this segment is because the White House response to this is insane. Put this up there on the screen. The White House Chief of Staff, Ron Klain, tweets this, quote, "I hate to spoil the narrative, but this poll shows POTUS approval rating moving up and solid public confidence on the two biggest problems that he inherited, COVID and jobs." And what they're pointing to is that, he has a high, percent of approval on COVID and, jobs, kind of.
It's, okay, on COVID, it's 53-47.
Yeah.
An issue that, has really moved to the back burner in terms of people's top concern.
Nobody cares about COVID.
Jobs, 52-48. On the approval rating thing, it's particularly dishonest. It's quote unquote moved up to 44. It was 42% last month, within the margin of error.
So you're within the margin and you're below 50 and you're also the most unpopular president of our modern times, well, or at least tied with Donald Trump. That takes skill. I mean, in terms of how bad that is. And at least Trump, what they would always say is they'd be like, yeah, but he has a great approval rating amongst Republicans, which actually did turn out to mean something whenever it came to Republicans who were going to back him no matter what.
Yeah, that's
Half of Democrats don't even want Biden to run anymore. Yeah. They don't approve of the job that he's doing. They think that he's not paying attention to the major problems in the economy. So you have no base enthusiasm. There's not a lot of people out there who identify as Biden stans. There is no organic Biden movement. And I guess, the whole reason he was elected was simply to, lessen the drama and make the trains run on time. He said he knew a lot about trains. And yet every single thing in the economy seems chaotic. And the worst part is he does not seem to be relentlessly focused on it. And, I think that the visuals on this stuff are really bad, especially we've talked about the Ukraine aid. You could support it if you want to. I think it's way too big and doesn't have enough constraining powers on it. But $40 billion that was passed bipartisan to Ukraine. That was easy, not just with Congress, but in terms of the administration, where their focus is the baby formula shortage is happening, completely scrambling gas, diesel, food. I mean, so many of these other things. I'm not saying many Republicans would vote for big packages for all of those, but at the very least, the administration should be focused on them because the people out there are at the very least buying a lot of Republican messaging on this stuff. And why wouldn't they if they were to point to the fact that the alternative is literally nothing done by the executive who has had a long time in order to deal with these things and continues to have the space to make it a public conversation? I mean, why is he in Asia right now? I don't get it. I'm not saying the Asian alliances, I think they're probably the most important things in the world, but why are you on some grand foreign tour? This is the main focus of yours. And on foreign affairs, he actually still only has some 55% approval rating.
Yeah, he gets decent approval rating on his handling of Ukraine, whatever. I mean, the media has really backed him up on that. I think that explains a lot of it. I think on the Asia trip, what the administration would say is this deals directly with these supply chain issues and focusing on the long term to make sure that this doesn't happen again. But to your point, you got some really short-term immediate fires that you need to deal with right here and now. So I think voters are probably not going to reward him for that longer-term play. Also devastating within these numbers is the fact that the demographic group by age that gives him the worst marks is the youngest voters. So once again, it's voters under 30. 66% of voters under 30 say he's too slow to react, and they also gave him very bad marks on cares about people like me. I think your point about that one is really important because that was a core strength of Biden.
That was huge.
Core strength of Biden was basically his record sucks and we didn't like these other things he did and he's verbally incontinent and probably on the decline. But I do feel like he's kind of a genuine person that has got that everyman vibe that gets what my family's going through and I have a general affection for him. The fact that those numbers now have fallen off a cliff that really is devastating because that used to be a sort of key strength for him. As far as the Ron Klain attempt to spin these numbers, which is hilarious, it reminded me of, remember what he said after Macron was able to win the French presidency? He tweeted then, An interesting observation, just FYI, President Macron appears to have secured a double-digit victory over Le Pen at a time when his approval rating is 36%. Basically saying, like, oh, see, there's a path to win the presidency back, like win re-election, even when your approval rating is extremely low. So clearly this is the path that Klain and probably others around him have decided is the way for Biden to get back in the White House next time around. People aren't happy. They're not going to be happy. They're not going to be in love with him. But can he be a superior alternative to Donald Trump where people show up to vote for him not because they really want to, but because they feel like they have no other choice? I mean, that's a very dim view of politics, especially this, early in the presidency, to already have basically given up on having a high approval rating when he came in with a high approval rating. So it's not like it's not possible, but that clearly seems to be the track that his people are focused on.
Good luck. And, basically only Trump running a campaign purely focused on stop the steal would be able to save you if that were the case.
True.
And
which
by the way,
may be what they
that
face.
Might happen.
Yeah,
so
indeed.
That's what we deserve. Okay.
Okay, guys, earmuffs for any kids out there. I regret to inform you we now have to talk about Elon Musk's dick. Let's go ahead and put the tear sheet up on the screen. I'm just going to read a significant amount of this. So this is from Business Insider. I do want to say this is from a reporter, Rich McHugh, who is not a hack whatsoever. He was the producer who worked with Ronan Farrow to take down Harvey Weinstein, much to the chagrin of the Clintons. He also is the reporter who did the serious journalism investigating Tara Reade's claims against Joe Biden. So he has a news story about Elon Musk regarding a settlement paid by SpaceX for some claims made by a flight attendant. So here's the headline. SpaceX flight attendant said Elon Musk exposed himself and propositioned her for sex. Documents show that the company paid $250,000 for her silence. Let me give you the details here. So this attendant worked as a member of the cabin crew on a contract basis for SpaceX's corporate jet fleet. She accused Musk of exposing his erect penis to her, rubbing her leg without consent, and offering to buy her a horse in exchange for an erotic massage. Okay. Sorry, I shouldn't laugh. That's so weird. According to interviews and documents obtained by Insider, the incident, which took place in 2016, is alleged in a declaration signed by a friend of the attendant and prepared in support of her claim. So this document, this declaration from the friend, and the friend is the person who was the source here for Rich McHugh, this was as part of the mediation process by which they came to this $250,000 settlement amount. He says the details in the story are drawn from this declaration as well as other documents, including email correspondence and other records shared with Insider by the friend. According to that declaration, the attendant confided to that friend that after taking the flight attendant job, she was encouraged to get licensed as a masseuse so that she could give Musk messages. Gross, that massages rather. It's sort of gross to me that she was encouraged or sort of forced to get this masseuse license on her own dime, by the way. It was during one such massage in a private cabin on Musk's Gulfstream that she told the friend Musk propositioned her. The flight attendant told her friend, the billionaire SpaceX and Tesla founder, asked her to come to his room during a flight for a, quote, full body massage. When she arrived, she found that Musk was completely naked except for a sheet covering the lower half of his body. During the massage, the declaration says Musk, quote, exposed his genitals and then, quote, touched her and offered to buy her a horse if she would, quote, do more, referring to the performance of sex acts. Apparently she was into horses, so the horse thing was not completely insane. The attendant's complaint was resolved quickly after a session with the mediator that Musk personally attended. The matter never reached a court of law or an arbitration proceeding. In November 2018, Musk, SpaceX, and the flight attendant entered into a severance agreement, granting the attendant a $250,000 payment in exchange for a promise not to sue over the claim. So basically what happened here is she gets hired on a contract basis as a flight attendant. She says that she was pressured to get this massage license on her own dime so she could give massages. Apparently, I didn't know on SpaceX, like, massages.
I was going to say, my main takeaway from this thing is why does a company need an in-house masseuse?
Yeah,
as a perk for executives.
That's a problem.
That's pretty weird.
Especially, listen, it is weird.
Yeah.
And if that is part of the job, then you hire people who are professionally trained masseuses, or if you want your attendants to get that certification, then you pay for it. Okay, so I have an issue with that.
Okay.
So then the allegations unfold. She was reportedly, according to the details from the friend, she was very stressed about it, but she thought, okay, we can just put it behind and I'm just going to pretend like nothing happens and move forward. She also alleges she was basically retaliated against for not going along with the horse for sex deal. So that's what we know. The part we can say for sure is that there was this $250,000 settlement between the company and this woman who is not being named in the piece to protect her privacy. She also, I mean, this kind of gets the free speech thing. She also is bound by a non-disclosure agreement. She's not allowed to talk about it legally. Those type of non-disclosure agreements in cases of sexual harassment and assault have been banned in certain states like California, but she is still under one, so that's why, one of the reasons why she's not talking here.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, look, I really don't know whether this is true or not. Obviously, there's no way to, right? So this is based on the affidavit of a friend. Also, in terms of the payout, it was not actually about the sexual harassment claim. It was about the fact that she was retaliated against. That's what she would file under California employment law. So $250,000. I mean, it's not.
Yeah, but retaliated against.
Right, because of
sexual harassment.
Right, certainly. Again, I don't know if it's true or not. Musk himself appeared to know whether it was coming. So here, seemed to know that it was coming. Let's put this up there on the screen. He had tweeted previously that in the past I'd voted Democrat because they were mostly the kindness party. Now they've become the party of division and hate, so I can no longer support them. I will vote Republican. Now watch their dirty tricks campaign against me unfold. He followed up by that saying, political attacks on me will escalate dramatically in the coming months. And so he's casting this as a part of this. I, in general, have not seen this kind of take the world by storm exactly with this story. I think the most important thing with these things is that you should also look for others and whether there was any retaliatory actions or other people to come out of the woodwork. So we're kind of in that phase. And especially if there's any reporters who are working on that, that will serve as a very big corroboration. I will say what they have said is that at least 6 women have sued Tesla, alleging sexual harassment at a Tesla factory, but none of the people who were there were alleged against Musk himself. So this is the only one that we know of currently. I did read Musk. I've read Musk's biography and some other pretty critical stuff into him. And in general, I'd never seen any reporting around this, but obviously this was paid. So, that's not deniable.
Yeah, right. Listen, there's no way to know what happens. I think you're right in terms of the public perception. If now there are more women who come out.
Then it's,
Then it definitely, now, I mean, listen, it can be that there is only one woman that's only done to one person. That doesn't mean that the claims are invalid or not true. And as we said, the thing we definitely know is they did pay it very quickly, pay a settlement to this woman to keep her quiet and make sure that she doesn't sue. So that's what we know. I do want to say one thing about his tweet there about Democrats are the kindness party. First of all, I think it's a very childish way of viewing politics. But second of all, the first comments he made saying that it was at that convention for the, what is it called?
All In podcast. Yeah, that's right.
And his first comments were mostly focused on Democrats are too close to unions. And unions, he said, are another form of monopoly, which I don't even understand how you can make that case, but whatever. But it was sort of like it was that, and he didn't like that they were close to trial lawyers. It was this very just standard issue plutocrat critique of I don't like that I might have to deal with a union or that I might get sued for bad behavior. And then once there was kind of an outcry about the way he framed that, then he puts out this tweet that's much more and they're divisive, et cetera, et cetera.
I will defend him on the union thing only within what happened. Now you guys know I'm pro-union and I've always supported it. That being said, I think it's BS that he got that there was that lobby that the unions pushed that make it so that the EV tax credits did not apply as much to Tesla and applied more to Ford and GM.
Yeah, but he also is a notorious union buster.
All right, listen, I'm not going to support him on that.
Typical Wall Street capitalist
I totally agree with you. But I'm
why
saying
they don't support the
Democratic
Democratic
Party. Explicitly lobbied against Tesla. And by the way, if the Tesla people want to unionize, I would 100% support that. But what I'm saying is that the unions have used their political power to strike against him with the EV tax credits.
But here's the other thing
I think is wrong. I mean, it's a good electric.
That was ridiculous. Is he was Biden is so close to the unions and does the bidding of the unions and so different from Barack Obama on this, which is also silly because we see Biden right now has the power to back up the Amazon labor union and isn't lifting a finger to do it. He'll have the photo op with him. So the analysis was silly.
I agree. I'm saying in his mind, and look, I think every person is selfish and his context is Tesla. Tesla has been explicitly screwed over by the Biden administration. Pete Buttigieg won't even meet with Elon Musk.
Yeah, but don't you think it's telling that after he says that, then he switches to, no, it's because they're divisive.
Totally, 100%.
Yeah.
But I'm just, I will say, I think that if you're a serious person, then EV tax credits should be flat. And we should encourage EVs as much as humanly possible.
Agreed.
And that in that case, the unions messed up by using their political power on that.
But he didn't even mention that.
No,
wasn't
I
even
agree.
his claim.
But I'm saying the Biden people too, the fact that they're ostracizing Elon Musk, who has done more for this country in terms of the electric revolution than any other person, I think that's BS.
Okay, but that's not even what he was talking about.
I think that's the context of his
he didn't even, it's not even what he said in his statement, though. I mean, I guess my bottom line here is he's acting exactly like you would expect a self-interested billionaire to act.
Very true.
So,
especially for his company, which I agree with. Okay.
I don't agree with.
Let's move on.
Anyway,
Hillary.
Let's talk about Hillary Clinton.
All right, let's go ahead and talk about Hillary. So this has been all over the place, and there's a lot going on in terms of the actual findings. So the long-awaited Durham trial, which has basically become a meme online, has actually been happening. So let's put this up there on the screen. This is according to testimony from Robbie Mook. You guys might remember that name. It was Hillary Clinton's campaign manager testifying in the trial regarding Michael Sussman. Now, what he says is that Hillary Clinton personally approved leaking to the media information alleging a connection between Donald Trump and a Russian bank in 2016, which the campaign itself had not fully confirmed. This is the infamous Alpha Bank report that took the world by storm in the closing days of the 2016 election, in which there was an allegation that there was a data between some servers linking the Trump organization and Alpha Bank. That is a Russian financial institution with ties to the Kremlin. That was originally reported by Franklin Foer over at The Atlantic and in Slate, where he wrote this up and was used as a so-called corroborating evidence. This is the infamous tweet that Hillary sent on that day. Let's put this up there on the screen. October 31st, 2016. Computer scientists have apparently uncovered a covert server linking the Trump organization to a Russian-based bank. This was regarding the Franklin Foer report, who also works at The Atlantic, but he wrote it up in Slate, showing that the Trump organization has a, quote, secret server registered to Trump Tower that has been covertly communicating with Russia. Noteworthy, it was signed at that time by Hillary for America senior policy advisor Jake Sullivan, who is the current national security advisor to the United States for President Biden. So obviously, he remains well ensconced in Democratic politics. And I think that all of this matters because, first of all, I mean, I know it was 6 years ago, but I do think it is empirically nuts that Hillary, at this point, we know that she lied for years about whether they funded the dossier, the Steele dossier, and they did. We know that her lawyers, and the Perkins Coie law firm and others were intimately involved in pushing a lot of this, that it basically was a Democratic, and by that I mean like it was a Hillary Clinton operation that was in conjunction with the FBI, that they explicitly went and briefed them on all of these fake accusations. And really, I mean, Alpha Bank and others, while it did show the most insanity of Russiagate, this was a national conversation for 2 straight years about Trump and Russia, which at the time did, I think, tremendous damage to this country. I mean, beyond the Democratic base, gaslighting them into thinking that the election was stolen by Russians, which a majority of them did actually. At the time, you also had a complete media obsession when there could have been an obsession around, I don't know, literally anything else, which was actually true. So, it's been 6 years. I guess everybody also knew that this was the case, but it just shows you that Hillary's fingerprints were on this at the very, very highest level.
There's a lot that's relevant here. I mean, first of all, the fact that there was an intentional effort by the Clinton campaign to basically say, like, how do we spin this law so it doesn't fall on us? Because obviously you lose to Donald Trump, like, the obvious person to blame is you, right? You didn't campaign in the Midwest. You were a terrible candidate. You leaned into this campaign strategy of just sort of like going wherever Trump went, responding to his tweets and responding to his actions rather than trying to lay out your own campaign. Like, you are to blame for this loss. And so to the extent that, Donald Trump was seen as this existential threat by the Democratic base, the very obvious person to blame would be Hillary Clinton. Instead, they've engaged in this very intentional campaign of subterfuge to push the blame off to all sorts of people. One of them, one of those claims being like, oh, it's Russia's fault, basically. So this is also part of that effort for the Clintons and that whole world, which is the entirety of establishment Democratic politics, to escape any kind of scrutiny for how you could possibly lose to this man and put the country in this situation. So that's number one. Number two, in terms of the actual details here, and this was Robbie Mook that testified. So this was the
under oath on the stand,
right?
Yeah.
So I mean, this isn't like some nobody. This was the chair of the head of the campaign. He said effectively Hillary signed off on this idea that even though they couldn't as a campaign confirm these claims or that this connection was real, that they would leak it to press outlets. And at that very same time, Slate runs with it and gives them the piece that they want, and that's the one that they go with. The New York Times also runs an article, but it is much more cautious, and it includes the key piece of information that the FBI had already basically investigated and debunked these claims.
Right.
So if it had just been the New York Times piece, they wouldn't have had much to work with. But because Slate went with a much more sensationalistic and much more sort of leading piece here that left the question open, that was what enabled them to kind of lean into this. So that's extremely significant to your point about the damage that was done and why we're still talking about this so many years later. It really did change the way that the Democratic base viewed Russia, and it changed the way the Republican base viewed Russia. So now you have a situation where, views have, in certain instances, flipped. You have much more room on the Republican side of the aisle, for example, to be questioning of the amount of military aid that is flowing to Ukraine. And of course, I've talked about how disingenuous some of these actors ultimately are. But the fact remains that the only no votes against this gigantic tens of billions of dollars in new aid, most of it, military aid, going to Ukraine, came to the Republican side of the aisle. This whole episode made the Democratic base much more hawkish towards Russia. And the very latest is, let's go ahead and put this last tear sheet up on the screen. The very latest is the Pentagon is apparently weighing deploying special forces to guard the Kyiv embassy. So basically, a small number of boots on the ground in Ukraine, something that was supposed to be totally off the table. And the reason why we've been able to so easily slide down the slippery slope closer and closer to direct confrontation with a nuclear armed superpower in Russia is because you have a Democratic base that has been primed to see Russia as this all-powerful, all-knowing, existential, world-dominating, election-interfering threat. And that has made it a lot more difficult to have clear thinking and any sort of public debate and scrutiny over the administration's truly extraordinary actions with regard to Russia right now.
Yeah, it's a huge thing. I mean, the impact this has had on our, I think I did one of my last monologues on Rising was actually about this. It was the real cost of Russiagate. And it was about how, I think at the time it was the Atlantic Council. And there was this Democratic aligned people who were, promoting a realist foreign policy view, of which I mostly subscribe to, were basically railroaded and forced out of the Institute, and there was an uproar over there just because
I remember that.
I don't even remember exactly what they said, but they were like, hey, maybe expanding NATO might have increased tension with Russia. It was something completely anodyne, and then boom, it was just went completely against them. So that was at an institutional level, at a Democratic-based level, and on a policy level. It changed our posture to Russia forever, I think, towards that nation. And all you have to do is compare how Barack Obama reacted to the Russian annexation of Crimea to how the Biden administration has approached it now. And you can go back and read quotes of Obama saying things which would, call him a traitor now, where he says things like, Crimea is a core Russian national security interest. If you think we should go to war for that, you should justify it, because I don't think that that's one as core to Ukraine. It's wow, that's something I haven't heard anybody in national politics espouse that type of sentiment.
What was his line to Romney, the 80s called?
And the 80s called, and they want the foreign policy. He was right, about in terms of moving towards the Asia Pacific and how that was the future. But all of that worldview has been completely cast out the window, all because of Russia. And you can go and look back at, Obamagate, which I'm reliving now in my head, and it all is a direct result of the fact that the Clinton campaign, and actually did also push the FBI and even the high levels of the Obama administration to all try and conjure up this narrative, which simply did not exist, and not only hampered the incoming administration, but changed our politics probably forever. And that was not done in a good way.
Indeed.
Krystal, what are you taking a look at?
Well, guys, why don't Democrats keep the basic promises they make during their campaigns? Why do they so rarely stand up to corporate power? Why did they, for example, abandon prescription drug pricing reform, let alone broader healthcare reform? Why did they give up on politically popular populist issues like hiking the minimum wage? Why did they fail to curb union busting by using the power of the federal government to deny taxpayer dollars to labor law violators? We've explored a lot of typical explanations, and all of those certainly play a part. You've got the coziness between the nation's financial and political elite, the epidemic of big money in our political system, the corporate revolving door that keeps White House officials wanting to protect their means of cashing in after they're finished with their time in quote-unquote public service. You can think of Jay Carney there, going from White House press secretary for Obama to Amazon executive smearing black workers. But one influential corner of Democratic politics has often escaped scrutiny. It is more influential than you might realize, and it is absolutely rotten to the core. That is the dirty world of Democratic Party political consultants. The tawdry and destructive relationship between these firms and the Democratic politicians they advise has burst into the open recently with revelations that a top firm, Global Strategy Group, or GSG, was deeply involved in Amazon's unsuccessful Staten Island union-busting campaign. According to a new deep dive from the American Prospect, GSG was truly spearheading that union-busting strategy. As part of that campaign, quote, the Democratic-aligned operatives at GSG monitored union leaders' social media accounts, created and distributed anti-union public relations materials, and bombarded workers with flyers and communications. They also organized and participated in mandatory anti-union meetings that were billed as trainings. Now, GSG is not some rogue or fringe Democratic firm. It is as deeply enmeshed in the Democratic establishment elite as any firm possibly could be. They worked with politicians from Joe Manchin to Ed Markey to Kirsten Gillibrand. They boast famous alums like White House press secretary and new MSNBC personality Jen Psaki, who served as senior vice president of their D.C. office for a time. Disgustingly, they both helped former Governor Cuomo craft his "I'm not a crook, I'm just an Italian" defense for repeated sexual harassment, and also advised the Time's Up organization, which was supposed to be holding powerful men to account for sexual harassment. Of course, the Time's Up organization itself got caught in bed with Cuomo and famously ignored a credible report from Tara Reade of sexual assault because the accusation was against Joe Biden during his campaign. But I digress. According to reporting from The Intercept, GSG's gross corporate clients do not stop at Amazon. Not even close. They've worked with any number of Silicon Valley monopolists, from Meta to Microsoft to Google. They have not been shy about oil and gas money either, doing work for Chesapeake Energy Corp and Lukoil, one of the top companies in Russia. They've worked for the ghouls on Wall Street at places like Goldman Sachs, Citigroup, and JP Morgan Chase. They've cozied up to the criminals of Big Pharma, including Pfizer, GlaxoSmithKline, and one of the greatest villains of the century, Purdue Pharma, which knowingly sparked the opioid addiction crisis. Now, this is far from an exhaustive list, and no one in DC blinked an eye at any of it until now, when the public, which is overwhelmingly supportive of the Amazon workers, became aware of the supposedly liberal firm's dirty union-busting deeds and corporate PR campaigns. Now, according to Politico, the DNC is considering banning its political consultants from this type of work. Unions drafted a contract addendum that would require firms to certify they are not helping with union busting, are not helping companies in labor disputes, and are not advising on the other side of ballot initiatives that the labor movement opposes. Now, that last part about ballot initiatives would also hit GSG where it hurts, since that company also works for both Uber and Lyft, who are attempting to kill grassroots efforts to properly classify their drivers as employees rather than contractors. While this reform from the DNC, led by unions, would be a start, a glance at GSG's client list proves that they would still be free to serve as paid corporate mercenaries for all sorts of corporate interests who are, at least in theory, opposed to Democratic Party priorities. What's more, It's almost unfair to pick on GSG here, as they are really just following standard operating procedure for big money DC grift. You would be hard-pressed to find a DNC consultancy that was not in bed with many of these same interests. Ryan Grim and Rachel Cohen did a deep dive last year on this disgusting swamp that exists to sell out the American people. GSG is in very good company here. Joe Biden's campaign manager, Jen O'Malley Dillon, she co-founded Precision Strategies, which works for health insurers, big tech, and Wall Street. Dewey Square Group, home of famed Clinton world aide Mignon Moore. They work for Democrats and also corporate clients, including undermining Ohio's renewable energy portfolio standards. Another DC giant, SKDK, routinely takes on corporate work from clients like Gillette and American Airlines, as well as helping TransCanada push their Keystone XL pipeline. The DCCC's top pollster, Greenberg Quinlan Rosner, or GQR, they've worked with such nefarious actors as Monsanto, Blue Cross Blue Shield, and the Business Roundtable. You could also spend months mapping the tangled and incestuous relationships between these consultancies, the corporate world, and the Democratic Party clients they represent. Just as one example, at GQR, one of their top partners, Elizabeth Sena, is married to the former executive director of the DCCC, the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, Dan Sena. Do you think husband is going to steer congressional campaigns towards an adversarial relationship with corporate America when his wife's paycheck literally depends on the largesse of the nation's economic royalists? Probably not. Also understand there are massive amounts of money at stake here. This is a multi-billion-dollar industry, and the top partners at these firms are millionaires, made rich by what is literally a cartel run by the current Democratic Party establishment. The reason they will fight so hard and pull every dirty trick in the playbook to destroy people like Bernie Sanders or Nina Turner is because a new regime means the destruction of their cycle of extreme grift. I mean, it is not like these people are even good at their mercenary jobs. They are perennial failures who come up with terms like trumped-up trickle-down and manage to lose union-busting campaigns for Amazon, even when the odds are massively in their favor. They keep hold on power through a rigged marketplace, and any change in regime means their sorry, losing, out-of-touch ways would be significantly curtailed. That's why, famously, the DCCC blacklisted all firms that work with left candidates looking to oust corrupt Democratic incumbents, while happily maintaining their contracts with union busters and corporate crooks. The left candidates have at least the potential to upend their monopolistic hold on the Democratic Party purse strings. Now listen, in an ideal world, these firms would be the brains and the muscle behind the movement to curb corporate power, providing advice to candidates, electeds, advocacy groups, and unions to help them design everything from messaging to legislation to tools for mobilization. These are the people who are driving strategy on every campaign call, who are conducting the polling that politicians lean on so much in the absence of having actual principles. These are the people who staff elite Democratic Party apparatus, the DCCC, the DNC, the DSCC. They are also the people who serve in Democratic administrations. When Democrats are in power, this consultant class is also in power. And they are not just conflicted, they are completely sold out. The results we get then are entirely predictable. And listen, Trump was a liar and he was a failure, but he was right in this assessment. Nothing will change in DC until we drain the swamp. And this little insight with GSG into their union busting campaign has really opened up a whole can of worms. Because you know, these are the people, this is the class of people more than anyone who runs this town. Oh, yeah. Impact on the campaigns. They're the pundits you see on TV. They staff up White House administrations.
They run everything.
They're sort of like a second deep state in a way, because they are this permanent political class who, you know, their livelihoods, their millions depend on keeping things as they are. And so they will do anything to block like any change to the status quo.
Oh yeah, these are, you know, permanent deep state is a perfect example. They're almost like a fifth estate of government, like the consultant class, it's hard to describe to people who don't live here, who don't really understand, but the way it works is that you'll never want for a job, even if you're out of office. You always have, so, you know, I mean, Jen Psaki worked for these firms.
You've been terrible at your job.
It doesn't matter.
Like,
actually, the worse you are, the more you get
Think
paid.
of that Tara McGowan.
Oh yeah, that's right.
She's the
Shadow
one
app.
who destroyed the Iowa caucus with her Shadow app. Like, they were the ones that backed that and created that and also had all these gross ties to Pete Buttigieg. they just get rewarded. I mean, she's been like elevated.
Multi-million-dollar contracts, you know, more DNC ties. It's nuts. Yeah, GSG is a good example as well. I mean, what these people do is that their ties to big money, because that's how they make actually half of their money. It's not just from the political consultants. It's from the corporations who are trying to buy their influence with the people who work for them. Jen Psaki doesn't just end up working for Fortune 500s. Anita Dunn doesn't just end up working for Harvey Weinstein. They're hired guns. Like, that's what they do at their very best. And it's a complete cottage industry sham, really, that runs so much of government that people don't even really realize.
Yeah, it's a non-competitive cartel. So even if you don't care about corporate, you just actually want, you know, if you're on the side of Team Blue and you want Democrats to win, these people are terrible at their jobs. The only reason they continue to exist and get paid is because it is truly like a monopolistic, it's a cartel. That is what it is. And then if you do actually care about the issues and you want Democratic politicians to stand up to corporate power, these people are your biggest barrier because they're getting paid on one side by corporate America and they're doing work for these Democratic politicians. And if you think they're going to bite the hands that feeds them, think again.
Yeah, I think that's right.
All right, Saagar, what are you looking at?
Well, everyone, I know it's time to talk about gas again. And I also know I've been beating this one to death. But I just cannot fathom how normalized it has become to pay astronomically high gas prices across the country with no attention from the media or the administration. Day after day after day, retail gas prices hit the all-time high. When I was writing this, the national average of price gas was $4.59 a gallon, with the western United States getting especially hammered. California gas is an average price of $6 a gallon, with prices over $5 in Washington, Oregon, Nevada, Alaska, and Hawaii. We are talking about tens of millions of Americans here who are getting hosed day after day after day. And the more data that rolls in, the more devastating effect that just the price of gas is having on the pocketbook is seen. The current price is destroying household balance sheets, with the typical household in the United States spending $4,800 a year on gas at the annualized rate. That is 70% more than just 1 year ago when they were spending $2,800. So if you do the math, that means that the gas increase alone took your stimulus check of 2021. Just gas, not to mention food, other travel costs, rent, healthcare, other fixed monthly expenditures, all of which are also increasing. That's insane, and there's genuinely no end in sight here. If you factor in everything, household savings today are $9,000 less than just last year. That does not equal any amount of public support that you have received and constitutes a massive tax on your family. Here's the sad part. It is almost certainly going to get worse. Right now, JP Morgan is predicting that the entire United States will have a $6.20 average of gas this summer, when the driving season really kicks off, with a combination of factors that actually are very much under our control. First and foremost is obviously demand. But of course, the supply question should also be asked. Right now, gas inventory is at the lowest seasonal level since 2019 and dropping. The reason for the drawdown is that we are currently exporting a large chunk of our gas to Mexico and Latin America due to their sky-high demand, which is across the world and as a result of the supply crunch which was induced by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Low supply, high demand. Exporting whatever stocks you got laying around, that's how you get $6 a gallon across the entire country, which means like $7.50 a gallon in California. So I just spent the last few days talking to as many experts as I could. What can you try to do that the Biden administration apparently is refusing to do? What the hell can we actually do in the immediate term to actually lower the price of gas? Here's what I discovered. Number one actually seems relatively obvious. The Biden administration can look at why exactly we are exporting all of this gas abroad. The obvious answer as to why the oil companies are doing it is because they make money. Why should they not print money when it's our gas that we pumped out of our soil and is driving up our consumer prices for us? Some experts I spoke to disputed that banning exports would alleviate the price all that much. But last time I checked, supply and demand is the most ironclad law of economics. Increasing the supply of gas available to American consumers is actually an easy thing the administration can do under its authority in the 1975 Energy Policy and Conservation Act. Second, the administration should probably consider temporarily suspending the Jones Act for crude oil. Let me explain. The Jones Act is a 1921 piece of legislation. It mandates that all goods shipped between U.S. ports must be on ships built in the United States and U.S. flagged. Given that our ships are a lot more expensive to build and run than the rest of the world, this obviously creates a supply crunch. Now, I support the ethos behind the act because it's to protect the American shipping industry, especially from undercutters in Asia. But look, desperate times call for desperate measures. Right now, there is a major disparity in the price of gas and diesel regionally across the country because only U.S. flagships can move petroleum products between regions like New York Harbor and the Port of Houston. Temporarily suspending the Jones Act for crude oil would allow foreign tankers already here to transport crude in between the U.S. ports, which would at least alleviate the short-term price differential in the crazy prices that we see on diesel on the East Coast and also gas prices on the West Coast. So we would all at least be in it together. Finally, in the medium term, we need some resilience. I think a lot of establishment Democrats need to suck it up, and they need to admit we are going to be using fossil fuels for a long time to come. You can hate it, and you can want to transition, which I certainly do. But no matter which way you slice it, we're using gas for at least the next 3 to 4 decades, even if you do have an electric revolution. You can accept it and make life easier for people, or you can ignore reality and push a dream which will not come to fruition for years while people pay heavily for your mistakes. And that's where we are right now. That is where we are today. One of the biggest choke points in our ability to deliver gas to our consumers is refining capacity. I've spoken before how one of the biggest refineries in the country burned down in the East Coast in 2019. And I asked, why hasn't anyone rebuilt it? Well, it turns out it's not just that one. We have not built a new refinery in this country since 1977, 40 some years ago. And it's because we made this bargain. We don't want to accept the environmental impact of refining oil on our shores. So we just import it from abroad. Who cares if Russia, Asia, China, India, and others pump disgusting byproducts as long as it's not on our soil? Well, that's fine until you're in a global supply crunch and it turns out you literally cannot refine enough oil or diesel for your population. That's what actual environmental racism looks like, CCing AOC and the rest of the identity-obsessed liberals. But it is the de facto effect of what the policy they are pushing is. We need some new refineries in this country, and actually building them here allows us to phase away from them when we desire. Globalization has and is wreaking havoc on the ability of Americans to fulfill the promise of manifest destiny, which is to move around freely on our beautiful and stunning continent. It is our birthright and our legacy. The more the price of gas skyrockets, the more life is ruined slowly for our citizens who have to make choices on where to cut back and when they should not have to do so. Each of the things that I've outlined here are ones that in the short term are actually pretty bipartisan. And yet I have not seen any person in the administration consider it even one time. And if you want to know Biden's greatest failure, this shows what it is. No imagination to solve our problems. Instead, we are at the whims of the status quo, which mean higher prices for all. And I think, Krystal, I mean, you know, look at the Jones Act thing. You and I support American labor. You and I are I will call myself a protectionist. I won't speak for you. But let the frickin' foreign tankers move some crude oil temporarily, okay?
Yeah, that was an interesting one. I didn't
know
occur to me
Yeah,
that
the
that
more
would
I
be
looked
good,
into
but-
shipping magnets, and so I'm like, oh, that's why the price of diesel is high here and not in Houston. Makes a lot of sense, actually, whenever you think about it. You could easily make it and still protect American labor in the short term, the long term, and keep the ships. The second one, I mean, whenever we're looking at exports, why are we exporting all this gas? And the more people I spoke to, the same answer. We live in a capitalist country. Because they can. And I'm like, yeah, okay, but they also get a lot of subsidies. And under the 1975 law, we declare oil a strategic asset, and we basically can control the entire price of oil by the president.
Well, you know,
so
there is a third way that allows you to maintain the quote-unquote dream, as you put it, of rescuing the climate from complete climate disaster and crisis and, you know, subjecting millions of people to famine and poverty and storms
You're
and
going to say nationalize,
disaster.
it's not going to happen. So, yeah.
Yes, I mean, that
but it's
really—
not going to happen. I'm saying this could actually happen today, like tomorrow.
But see, the problem with how you frame this, though, is you're like, listen, you got to just give up on this dream of like saving the planet from crisis. Focusing on the costs of today, which are brutal and important to consider because they're hitting working class people's budgets. But I mean, the science says you can't just say, too bad, we're not going to be able to, we're not going to be able to deal with this, so just give up everybody. And that's the issue I have. I mean, yeah, okay, it's true. Nationalization is not going to happen. But it is the most elegant solution because you can ramp up the refinery capacity. You can end the exporting of oil for the temporary. You can increase the amount of gas flow right now and prepare to wind it down over the long term. I'm not ready to give up on the idea of mitigating the worst of the climate crisis. I'm also not ready to give up on the idea that the U.S. can engage in big national projects that could actually rise to the task of dealing with the challenges of today. So while I agree with your short-term assessment, I mean, it's the things you lay down are pretty inarguable, especially the Jones Act thing, and I think they're also very politically feasible. What we really need to do to make sure we're not in this situation again, both from a nationalism perspective, from a national security perspective, and from a climate crisis perspective, is to make sure that we are aggressively, as a gigantic national project, moving towards renewables to include nuclear, moving towards electrification. I know these are things that you support, but even as difficult as it is and as impossible as it ultimately seems, the costs of not doing it are so great that we can't contemplate it. We can't go there.
Us nationalizing our oil industry ain't going to do anything about China and India. India and China are 60-some% of overall, in terms of overall polluters. So, what are we going to do? When I'm pointing to resilience, what I'm saying is that we need, in the short term, to be able to refine the amount of gas that we need. Absolutely. Even in the electric revolution, look, you need diesel. I mean, you can't. There ain't electric planes is the last time that I checked. You need jet fuel. These are all things which are dramatically expensive. And I have no confidence that a Democratic administration, given under the current one, is so constrained by the environmentalists who, look, I am a conservationist. I support that to my core. They do not support, at the end of the day, building new refineries. You have to suck it up sometimes and say, listen, I know this is bad, but right now, we are in a massive crisis.
I don't see any evidence that the Biden administration is really constrained by environmentalists, to be honest
currently,
with you,
there is no effort in order to try and expand capacity.
They've done next to nothing in terms of an actually serious climate environmentalist agenda. They've let Joe Manchin be, the head of the body, the committee in the Senate that would write the rules on all of that. So I think it's silly to imagine that AOC is controlling the environmental policy for the Democratic Party. My point is, listen, I think the Indian-China thing is kind of a cop-out.
But they literally do.
Yeah, but yes, but does that let us off the hook for trying to do anything? No, of course not. And if you look over we are overwhelmingly have contributed the most to carbon pollution of any country in the world. So to say it's not really our fault, I don't think that's accurate, or I don't think that's fair. And I also don't think it's right to say that our actions wouldn't ultimately make a difference in terms of, okay, then you have an ability to say, here's what we're doing and put pressure. China, as you know, has invested a lot of money in developing, battery technology and solar panels. I mean, they actually have made a concerted effort to move their economy towards a potential different future. So while I agree on the short term, I am by no means ready to say, it's a dream to avoid the climate crisis, because the consequences of not doing something serious about it are just too dire to hand wave away.
Here's my concern. We're going to still have to do fuel for the next 30, 40 years. So instead, what happened is the current policy, which is that we ban the ability to do anything here, and then we import it all from Asia and China. And that's what I mean by environmental racism. I mean, the solar policy is a good example. We are totally willing for Chinese kids to inhale toxic solar fumes as long as we get to hit our fake renewable targets.
Here's where I'll agree with you, is that because the policy is piecemeal and nonsensical, you end up with basically the worst of all worlds, where you're not doing anything serious about the climate crisis and you're forcing people to pay higher prices. That's why you need someone who actually has a long-term strategic vision and actual commitment to it, and at least one of the two parties not being completely sold out to the oil and gas industry and willing to enlist the American people in a larger scale national project that actually makes sense. Because you're 100% right, what we're doing right now makes no sense.
Thank you. All right, we got a great guest standing by, Elbridge Colby. He's going to be talking about Taiwan. Let's get to it. We got a great guest here, Elbridge Colby. He's a principal at the Marathon Initiative, and he's the author of a new book, The Strategy of Denial. We've had him on the show before. Bridge, we have very fortuitous timing here. We have a Taiwan expert booked. He was going to talk about NATO, but it turns out at the very same time, our president is abroad in Japan making some major comments about the defense of Taiwan when asked if we would defend them militarily. Here's what he had to say.
We didn't want to get involved in the Ukraine conflict militarily for obvious reasons. Are you willing to get involved militarily to defend Taiwan if it comes to that?
Yes.
You are?
That's the commitment we made. That's the commitment we made.
Well, Bridge, let's just get your immediate reaction to that. I mean, so full disclosure, you've written the book, you're an advocate of defense of Taiwan. We had you on for our debate segment, but just purely from an analytical point of view, what do you make of the president in his departure from strategic ambiguity here?
Well, I think he's wise, but I actually think I think he's right, but I think it's actually unwise in the sense that I actually think he's correct that we should and almost invariably would come to Taiwan's defense. The question is more whether we would be effective. But the thing is not to, the way I think about it is like we're kind of poking the dragon right now. I think we should maintain the sort of formal policy, almost like the fiction of strategic ambiguity, which is a kind of decades-old policy that allows us to kind of interact with the Chinese. But we should very clearly understand that we would come to Taiwan's defense. But the key there is actually to resource it and have the prioritization and the focus. And you mentioned Europe. We're not doing that right now. We're sending $40 billion to Europe, basically. And there's almost nothing to show for it in the Asia Pacific. And the situation is grave and it's deteriorating.
Let's just back up for a second for people who aren't, super enmeshed in Taiwan and the politics around this. Can you just explain to people what the policy has been, what is strategic ambiguity, and why this is such a dramatic shift in terms of U.S. policy?
Sure. I mean, so very briefly, there was a civil war in China. It was resolved in 1949. The communists won. The nationalist government that was U.S. aligned escaped to Taiwan. For a variety of reasons, we basically protected them, and there was an alliance. We actually recognized the government on Taiwan as the government of China. As part of the opening to China in the 1970s, we shifted recognition to Beijing, and we basically it's a contentious issue, but we basically acknowledged that there was one China and that we would not kind of push for Taiwan independence and so forth. One of the fudges was what is called strategic ambiguity, which is a formal policy where we don't make it clear officially whether we would come to Taiwan's defense. That said, there are things like the Taiwan Relations Act that Congress passed that say we would regard as a very serious issue. So there's the formal policy. What's changed is China's ability to do something. Mao wanted to take over Taiwan, but he couldn't. Xi Jinping wants to take over Taiwan, and he plausibly can.
Yes.
And so that's the big difference. And so we have been neglecting the focus. This is one of the reasons I wrote this book. But what this is about our kind of formal government policy. This is not the most important issue actually around this. It's the one that gets the most attention, but it's not the most important issue.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things originally, and let's pivot to that then, as you point to, like, okay, reviews on Taiwan aside, as you're pointing to, the current U.S. policy under the Biden administration is a major prioritization of Europe. Now, we have spent, I actually was informed very much by your analysis. I did a whole monologue here, how we have sent 50-some billion over to Europe, when the Europeans themselves have sent a total of like maybe 10, if you're using generous accounting. I mean, what does it mean, Bridge, in this age of where we're sending our excess javelin capacity, so much of our military aid, so much of our political complete obsession in terms of foreign policy is in Europe, in an area which, to my view, and I think yours as well, lacks the strategic, whatever you think about Taiwan, it seems far more strategically important to the future of the United States than of whatever happens in Ukraine.
Well, I think you're right. And I mean, look, this is not about Taiwan. I mean, frankly, I'm not thinking about Taiwan's interests, I'm thinking about Americans' interests. But when we think about that, by far the most important theater of the world is Asia. It's going to be well over 50% of global GDP. And by far the most significant threat out there is China. China is 10x the Russian GDP. And Taiwan is really close. It's central to the security situation in Asia, and I can go into that. But there's no buffer. There's no Ukraine. Taiwan is more like Poland, basically. And it's very difficult to defend. And so what I want to do is I want to deter a war. I want to prevent a war by deterring it. The thing that's happening is the Pentagon and some other places are saying some good things about China and Taiwan. But they're often saying, we're going to get to it in 2035. But the revealed behavior is a prioritization of Europe. And my point of view is like, look, I think a war is very plausible. China has the will to take over Taiwan. It increasingly has a way, and it may have a sense of urgency about it. So yes, I hear some good things from the Pentagon stuff, but if like we really thought a war with a superpower was on the verge of happening, wouldn't you think that things would be different?
Yeah.
Would you be sending $40 billion and having, let's be honest, members of both parties getting up and say, oh, it's one theater? Wrong. There are real choices, and now is the time to make them, and that's not happening. And I think frankly, I think we're at the point where people need to be aware of the accountability, where you could have a 9/11 commission or a Pearl Harbor investigation, and who's going to be responsible. And I think that's not just the sort of hippie lefties or whatever, because nobody expects them to do it. It's people who should know better, who should be prioritizing the primary threat, and that's not happening.
Yeah.
So I think what the administration would say in response, if I can play devil's advocate here, is look, the very fact that we made this trip, that Biden, the administration is actually walking back Biden's comments on all of this and saying, no, he didn't mean that at all, even though it was very clear, very clear what he said. But they say, look, we announced this economic bloc, which I'm also curious what your view is there. So this shows you we can walk and chew bubblegum at the same time. Yes, we have to focus on what's going on in Ukraine with Russia, but we also are very much focused on Asia Pacific and developments there, making sure that we're securing the supply chain and securing the sort of economic bloc so that China doesn't dominate the region. What would your response to that be?
Well, you may know that the comment "walk and chew gum" triggers me because if you were thinking that you were going to get into a superpower war, would you call it walking or chewing gum?
Yeah.
No, you'd call it like, I'm about to get into a marathon and I need to compete at the level of the Kenyans in the Olympics.
Yes.
Or I'm going to bite off, I don't know, pick your thing, I'm going to wrestle a bear and eat him. That's the kind of thing that we're talking about. So when people say, oh, we're going to walk and chew gum, that actually tells me that people have no serious understanding of what's involved. And the administration, yes, they say these things, but I mean, first of all, the Chinese are building a real military for it. So, and that is not about going and having pretty meetings. The administration talks up the Quad, it talks up its economic framework, and I have some sympathy for it and so forth. But that ain't the same as real military investments. Like, you're about to have Pearl Harbor. Are you ready? I mean, we actually were probably more ready before Pearl Harbor than what we're doing now. And so that's what I would say is it's a hard power thing, and resources are scarce, and not just military resources, political resources. What's he talking about with the president of South Korea and the prime minister?
Let's actually talk about that, the political resources, because you made a comment at the beginning that you think that U.S. coming to the military defense of Taiwan is inevitable. I would suggest that the political will is not in place to do that currently, although, we'd need to see polling and see what happens if these eventualities unfold. How are you reading that? Why do you believe that there would be the political will and that this would ultimately be inevitable?
I think it's a combination of the almost certain both domestic and international political pressure. So just on polling, and you guys would know better than I, my understanding of the polling on Taiwan is there's much stronger, actually support for defending Taiwan has increased significantly in the last few years. There's a Chicago Council poll. The Reagan Institute also did a poll that suggests that. Now, American views on these things are fairly plastic. On the other hand, the President of the United States, who's a very left Democrat, has basically said...
Would dispute that, but
well, I mean, from my point of view. Has basically said several times that he's prepared to defend, and the political opposition from the Republican Party is that we should do more and be prepared to do so. So I think if Biden fails to do it, he will have committed himself. The United States is already committed, and he will be humiliated. The United States will lose its first great power war in its history. Okay? Secondly, the international pressure, because of the importance of Taiwan to what I call the anti-hegemonic coalition in Asia, will be so controlling that if we don't act, you could act. I was talking to a senior diplomat from an Asia-Pacific country who was like, if we lose Taiwan, and this is not an extreme person or country, it's like if Taiwan falls, people will all cut deals. So I think that's the issue. The question, Krystal, the key is to drive down the costs. So I'm not theological about Taiwan. We may get to the point where we can't defend Taiwan, and then we will have to abandon it, but that will be disaster for us and for the region, although I'm thinking more about us.
And what do you make of the Zihan analysis? We had him on the show last week that basically says because of demographics, China is set to have massive demographic bust, which I think if you look at the numbers is pretty indisputable, especially since they had the one-child policy for so many years. So while you have many countries around the world that are facing this demographic bust in terms of their, workforce-aged population, China is an extreme example facing this down at the fastest rate in history, that's going to cause them all sorts of problems. And so the idea that they're this juggernaut that we must go to war with to protect our own interests is sort of far-fetched. I'm summarizing here. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but that was the gist of what I took from his analysis.
Well, a couple things. I mean, one, I would say I'm not an economist, but I'll confess that I'm skeptical of that kind of view. And secondly, even if he's right, we should prepare for the downside risk because we don't know what the future is. So, I mean, where's my skepticism? Well, yes, but demographic trends are happening all around the world. They're happening in the other Northeast Asian states. They're happening among the native born population here and in Europe and so forth. And even if, let's say the Chinese conk out where the Japanese left off, they'll still be an economy of roughly twice the size that we are. Look, I mean, financial industries, Elon Musk is still putting enormous investments into China. China's the largest trading partner, I believe, of most of the countries in the world. So I guess he could be right, but I frankly am skeptical. Secondly, though, what if he's wrong? So if he's right and we overprepare and do what I did, no big deal. Okay, we wasted some money and that would be bad. But I mean, the alternative is if I'm right and he's wrong and we didn't prepare, we will lose and we'll all live under the Chinese thumb.
I want to get to one of the things the trade-offs the administration is talking about right now, Bridge, which is that the U.S. is considering lifting tariffs to fight inflation. Now, I find this very interesting because one of the reasons that we have high inflation is because we have zero economic resiliency and we've relied on China and they make all of our stuff. But two, it is fine to say we have a Putin price hike and then lift tariffs on Beijing. And if you consider, what the long-term prospects of that economically are, especially from a strategic point of view and our own economic resiliency, this is why we're in the situation where we are right now. So I'm just curious for your view in terms of a total strategic kind of orientation the United States has under the Biden administration. What does that leave us vulnerable to in the future if there is chaos in Asia? Like you said, look, maybe we don't come to Taiwan's defense. If that's true, you're going to have a nuclear Japan, you're going to have a nuclear South Korea, you're going to have the entire region in chaos, and it might actually have a war in the first place. Regardless, it's going to have a massive impact on us. If you think Putin's price hike is bad, just wait until Xi's price hike for something like that. What do we have in the gas tank, rhetorically speaking, to even deal with that currently with the current administration's orientation?
Well, I think it's kind of nuts and not insane to be taking off the tariffs at this point when they haven't really satisfied. And we should be building up our industries at home anyway and increasing our resilience, as you suggest. And why are we giving the Chinese credit instead of building up our energy independence and so forth? Right. I mean, doing the other things that would make sense on inflation. So I think look, we're all sympathetic to what people are going through, but that's not the way to do it. And we're going to have a worse outcome if we increase our dependence on China going forward. One thing I will say is that what this shows you is that strategies for dealing with China in Asia that don't rely on military denial are not credible, because already the president is doing things like, so when somebody says, oh, we'll sanction the Chinese into oblivion or whatever, forget it, right? Mm-hmm. They're already talking about giving up the leverage because Yellen and all these people are banging the table. So Larry Fink is calling on the phone or something, right? So let's be real. If we don't have a military denial, and I would just say, Saagar, it's not so much, nuclear Japan would not be the worst outcome.
No, I actually kind of support it.
The worst, I think I talk about it in the book, but I think that the worst outcome is well over 50% of global GDP that's under China's control, that probably uses the yuan, that follows Chinese regulations, that is the gatekeeper for all American companies, indirect or directly, and we're all going to be working for that, right? Yeah. That's the world that we're going to live in.
What do you make of the economic bloc that was supposed to be the main news item coming out of this press conference before Biden did his thing? How significant is this? How similar is it to TPP? What's the impact ultimately?
I mean, I don't have a super strong. I mean, I'm sympathetic in the sense the middle class, the trade policy for the middle class. I'm very sympathetic, as I think you guys are, to that idea. And it's a tough. I mean, look, the real culprits in this are the people who gave globalization a bad name by over-financialization and not insisting that China and others follow the rules and so forth. So it's not the fault of the people who are now skeptical about trade. I think the IPEF, as I think it's called, it's not really landing very well in Asia. Yes. I mean, just because they want trade, they want open markets. Of course they do. They want to make more money.
But
we're
also
skeptical. But Americans don't want a TPP. Yeah. So, I mean, when a blob dweller like me says something like TPP is important, that's worse than meaningless. It's like counterproductive. What I will say is that I believe in a worker-friendly and middle-class-friendly trade policy. But also, we're going to be dealing with 1.4 or maybe 1.2 billion Chinese who have no data protections, who have no privacy protections. We need to have the scale for our companies to be able to compete. Mm-hmm. So I do think a quote-unquote free world sort of economic area is going to need to be where we move. The question is how to do that. I don't know what the answer is, but I think that's a real area where creative political leadership is going to be necessary.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, you have to be able to preserve both. And unfortunately, we have never seen any prioritization of the first one. And, there's no current guarantee, I would say, currently, that the current administration prioritizes that when you have the top leaders and the top Treasury Secretary and more saying, oh yeah, we should take off these tariffs on China. So the last thing I want to get to you is the urgency point of view that you said. You said that there could be some urgency on the Chinese part. What domestic political condition did they face where it would be urgent in order to do this?
Sure. Well, I mean, I'll tell you the one that I'm most worried about, which is that the defense, the military balance in the Pacific, our defense people are talking more about the 2030s. That's when a lot of our military investments, replacing the Reagan-era investments, will come online. It's also this quad, this coalition is kind of coming together. You can see it. Taiwan, South Korea is kind of becoming more aligned. So if you're China, you say, I've got an opportunity potentially right now, certainly in the coming years by 2027, why not act? If you look at why major wars have happened in the past, they've often happened because of this window of vulnerability. I don't put as much purchase into this one, but another thing that people do mention is the thing that Peter Zeihan was talking about. Well, if they know they're going off a demographic cliff and an economic cliff, well, let me get out ahead and build an economic zone that I control to avoid that outcome. So that actually makes it worse. Again, that I don't put as much stock in that. There's also the fact that Xi Jinping is specifically tethered his own leadership and what he calls the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, it's this big thing, to the resolution of the Taiwan issue.
Yes.
Again, I don't know if that's enough, but that's another factor. So again, I look at will weigh urgency and I get real worried.
The argument I've heard against the urgent case that you're making is that the sort of unified and larger than expected response to Ukraine may serve as some deterrent. What do you make of that argument?
I think it's kind of a wash. It's possible that I certainly think that the Chinese are taking a cautionary note. Part of it's that response. Part of it's the difficulties the Russians have had. But I will say a couple things. First of all, it's almost all in Europe.
Yep.
So it's European countries because it's a European issue. It's not crazy. It's not an alliance of democracies. It's basically mostly European countries. So and those countries will be less likely to take a similar line over Taiwan for a variety of reasons, partially because they've taken such a hit. It actually trades against their ability to do something against China. I was in a meeting with a senior German official a couple months ago who was like, hey, how can we get China to help us with Russia? Because they're taking a huge hit on the oil and gas extrication. So what? They're going to completely, strangle their own economy by doing that to China? China's 10x the Russian economy. And we can already see with the administration considering giving up these tariffs, the reality of what this is going to be. So I don't think, and in fact, Bill Burns, the CIA director, said he doesn't think that Xi Jinping's given up on the Taiwan issue at all. And Avril Haines, the DNI, said it's an acute threat. And I'm thinking, I guess the last point, if we have an acute threat of a major war that we're going to get into, shouldn't we be acting like it? Where is that?
Right.
Is it your sense at all that Xi is politically vulnerable?
Possibly. I mean, I think it's possible. Again, I wouldn't bet on it. And I think here's the thing. I call it the Madeleine Albright effect. I mean, Madeleine Albright famously or infamously said to Colin Powell on the Balkans issue, because Powell was Powell Doctrine restraint, post-Vietnam, and she said, why do we have this amazing military if we can't use it? So Chinese leaders are much stronger. So Chinese people are going to expect action. I mean, we would never have done the Iraq War in 1976 because we were like, God, I don't want to get in that kind of thing again, right? But then in 2003, we did this epically stupid thing, So the Chinese are going to have a similar dynamic where they're just a lot stronger and they expect it to be treated accordingly. Maybe Xi is a stronger variant, but I don't think it would be radically different than his plausible successors.
I think that's a great point. Bridge, I've learned a lot from this conversation. We really appreciate it. We're very fortuitous in having you on the show, so we really appreciate it.
Always
Thanks
a pleasure.
Very much.
Thanks.
Absolutely. Thank you guys so much for watching. Thank you for all our premium subscribers supporting the show. Reminder about the scheduling. We're going to be Monday, Wednesday, Thursday, and we will see you all on Wednesday.
See you guys on Wednesday.